The function of J-Seclo's coercion to overthrow the states is a subordinate contract with the Confederacy, which, coming from the military, has engaged in positions for many arguments from Scotus and others in order to say that the executive is superior to the judiciary, which means there are no co-equal branches of government in this system, at which point all of their verdicts are disqualified as fraudulent subversions of national security as an insurgent coup. Now that we've discussed that prerequisite, many of their positions is the engagement of systematic genocides and political targetings and assassinations, which includes the position of calling children or infants pedophiles, which allows them the position to engage in horrific malice and defamation against them, which allows the position to progressively use the false moralization of what they wanted to do, at which point they have the arguments in the ordinary men mechanism, where people who would have been in the military force or militia would be eased into the function of doing horrendous crimes against humanity, so long as they had certain social prerequisites, such as it being a group activity where they are allowed to leave if they want to abandon the rest of their comrades, which many of them, being effeminate, would refuse to be masculine enough to assert their independence in refusing the criminal act, at which point you have these functional psychological tricks conducted against them, such as the use of the defamations and the pseudoscience, such as the Nazi generation of the mechanism of genetic guilt, at which point they're guilty from birth on the basis of race, which cannot be verified by any scientific mechanism or measurements, which allows them the infinite diversity of saying anything that they want to do to anyone they want to do it for any reason they want to do it, qualified through the fraud, engages the use of these systematic lies, which allows them to compound their criminal abuses and normalize their criminal black market contracts. At which point you have the evolution of the original position. Now, their accusation against David's character assumes the position that there was some fraudulent support for the communist ideals, which is based upon my studies, them engaging in reverse psychology. They are the ones loyal to the Soviets, and thus they are the ones propagating the development of communism, which includes the social engineering of the black communities, which positions themselves in the position of attacking the Black Panthers on the basis of them being in opposition to the white nationalist advantage, at which point their long-term strategy being repelled outside of the engagement of them engaging in systematic subtle changes time by time until they inevitably collide to their full structure of Nazi power, at which point your position is that they would socially engineer the Black Panthers and black communities into the communist position, which is ultimately a trap because they're complaining about government abuses. And the position of communism is government control over the subject, which would make them more vulnerable to the government abuse in question, at which point you understand the fraudulent nature of this engagement. At which point the fact that it is a psyop does not deter from the fact that they would be able to have done this, and having been able to accomplish these actions is secondary to their criminal force. Outside of the positions where it is legitimately actual coercion, at which point you have these threats such as the abuses against David, the suppression of his status, the theft of his property, the defamations, which are all coercion, in order to compel speech, at which point these videos are representations of the use of coerced speech in order to give a coerced position or explanation on the terrorist insurrection, which is the functional Confederacy, which is seeking the development of the Nazis, which is engaged in the intelligence, such as the FBI, which have coerced the United States and was repelled by the military until it was infiltrated into the military, at which point the executive position of the military, ignoring or becoming derelict in duty by ignoring lawful orders of their superiors, includes the position of targeting David Bowles, as the projection states that he would become a general, at which point he is military force, he is a superior military force, his military intelligence oversight, at which point you have the systematic application of the systems of American security being countered by the criminal espionage war by the Confederacy for the implementation of the white nationalist Ku Klux Klan lynch mobs, at which point you have the systematic destruction of property and obstruction of contracts and other criminal actions, which increases the functionality of communism, or the position that Congress or any other group subordinate or not subordinate to Congress would unlawfully acquire the false permission or color of law to engage in the use of communism, such as the validation of secret slavery mechanisms for human trafficking systems so that people can be abused and coerced into work in compliance with the function of them as slave inferiors, at which point you have the systems collapsing upon them in order to create the communism. So you understand, J. Sekulow's Confederate side is the communists, at which point you have that as the explanation supporting the position that in the original version, the Black Panthers and the other victims would have been told about the projection of David. The prophecy in question is the birth of David under the position of his obstructed contracts, which would have been a part of the prophecy. The development of the schedule for the contracts would have been understood without the obstruction, at which point them receiving and relying upon it would actively build the supports of the network, at which point their validation in the anticipation of Liberate Fire Tiger qualifies the definition of how they would be designing the system of the network. Now, the Hollywood elites used to abuse the black community quite a bit, and then we engage in the position of the hyperwoke, which is the version of the hippies version, which is anti-war subversion. The FBI created the hippies in order to subvert those loyal to the anti-war effort as a defamation or attachment of association, at which point the hyper-woke position is designed as a defamation in the same mechanism in order to deter or social engineer people away from the original assumption of actual, legitimate, lawful, equal justice, at which point you have the systems in place by which to overextend the position of wokeness in order to defame actual, legitimate progress by its hyper extension or hyper reality or its hyper culture, at which point the excessive abuses which are innate to the creation of the woke culture is surveillance, Confederate terrorism, abusing them, such as the use of poisoning, such as the use of changing their hormones under the secret science as a mechanism of war, which is anything for any reason, at which point the supporters of these mechanisms have all agreed to the precedent of the government choosing what's to happen to you, at which point you're not in charge of your person, your papers, or your effects, and thus you're not secure or safe in your person, your papers, or your effects, as you are actively being maliciously poisoned as an act of war, which does not mean the mechanism science, which would require their consent and their agreement to receive payments for the mechanism of cooperating in the scientific adventure. At which points these subversions are inherent to the use of Confederate wizard cuckery. And to that position, those who support this are functionally the definition of status. The definition of status is similar to the definition of the originalists, which is the position of going to the historic positions of the government ignoring all forms of legal restraints, at which point the historic position where slavery as a moral issue was actively contested as a permanent problem that could not be reversed, at which point you understand that the functional position is the development and maturity of the renormalization of Confederacy. What they could not do by force, they are going to seek through infection. At which point you understand that these terrorist mechanisms are the position of that development. Now, what, pray tell, would happen if we developed these mechanisms in a legitimate way? You would have to observe what their obstructions would be. Who they are infers what they would have done, which defines the position of the obstruction of the use of work and the forming of the network, at which point the prerequisite has to be acquired that those peoples would do what they would have done in anticipation to construct the mechanism of their support under the birth of David, who was owed the position as born king with the schedule for contracts under the position of the intelligence estimate for that development into the stopping of the crash of '08 and stopping of 9/11 and the other Confederate developments being obstructed and subverted by David would have engaged in the position of exponential profits, which generate blueprints which are highly profitable to investors, at which point the position of the profits to those investors qualifies our ability to pursue the general concept of what they would have done, at which point they have to build their own list of obstructed actions that they would have actually in reality done without the use of the coercion under these understandings. Being an educated answer is required to have been given to them in order for them to react to it, at which point they, knowing to do so, would have to choose a thing to do, and what they would have done being obstructed by the censorship or the use of coercion, and the function qualifies as a criminal act of communism or obstruction of free market economics or contracts. David cannot control who wants to associate with him privately, but there is a position of the obstructed contracts of who he would have worked with, at which point the standard, I believe, is the position where you can observe the obstruction of contracts as a position of economic remedy, at which point the position of the freedom of association is the right to associate with the educated answer of the owner, the lawful owner of the title before subversion, which is the only way to protect the freedom of association, which is normally on a social level similar to the position of the economic standard, which is if you go into a corner store, you can't determine how many Slurpees you're going to sell by any relevant data, at which point it is an arbitrary thing. Their social relationships are not the subject in question outside of their educated second-party submissions passing through their second court of being educated in order to establish their social relationships, which is a prerequisite of the definition of human decency under the status which the government is not legally allowed to change without due process and in actual material crime from the expectation of the time of the case through due process, which is not the subversive kangaroo court, which includes their use of restraints against a target in order to change laws, at which point the prosecution of the person under the changed laws is an after-the-fact ruling under after-fact subject, which is immediately disqualified, which is one of the fundamental positions of J. Sekulo's coercion to overthrow the other states, is the position of after-the-fact rulings to the implementation of his conquering of the United States for the Confederates, which are the infected military seeking the use of criminal violence in the acts of treason against the United States, requiring the duel in order to get Congress to certify the lawful obligation to national security which is the declaration of war for the purpose of eradication of the Confederate threat, allowing us to mature the position in the lawful American standards for the complete remedy. And the secret to a remedy is essential to the Americans, as this is a criminal war, and thus the protections of the secrets from remedy is the position of Confederate loyalties, as insurrection for the Confederacy is the development of the normalization of slavery without cause for the implementation of the dismantlement and collapsing of society for the maturity of the Confederate plantation slavery, at which point the blacks and other groups who have been supporting them through the entire time, believing that they would have been a part of the Confederacy, will be turned on as they are house niggers, at which point the dismantlement of their systems, such as the socialists and the Christian or church groups and others in the Nazi system, use the socialists in order to develop the position, at which point you have the use of terrorism by the government in order to use voter fraud, which is Bill Barr's position on the position that the federal government can hire in its contracting the use of federal agents in order to target someone on the basis of the political affiliation in order to obstruct their vote, changing the position as an act of criminal terrorism for voter fraud. The mechanism of the system is long-term historic studies, which require the objective understanding of their historic loyalties and the strategies and mechanisms which are common to their kind, at which point you have the maturity of the understanding of where they are headed, at which point the development of their Satanist society is their fundamental loyalty, at which point their investment primarily into C students in order to engage in the hyperacceleration is the development of the destruction of the competent or elite in the actual legitimate education, as opposed to the subversive education in the Confederacy, at which point you have the matured position of their infinite degrading of intelligence as the ones in power swaying the most force or backed with the most force or the most money, being the least competent, allows them to be more easily controlled by their Druid religious overlight, as in the theocracy of their insurrection under the Confederacies, for their nigger whippings and abuses for their pure entertainment. Thus, the full study on the horoscope of Liber Tiger and its full diversity, including the various arbitrary books which they would have done, which were provided but then taken away, at which point I don't have the sources on hand as they are actively being manipulated. But the positions of those born on October 16th, 1986 includes the assumption of the inherent suspicion of mankind, as the darkness of man is inherent to his understanding, at which point you have the development of the perpetual suspicion, which leads to the zombie insurance, which is hyper-scrutiny against all economic subversions, at which point any fraud against him being digested into the network would receive the hyper-scrutiny, as the mechanism of choice would be to profit off of the failure of the product in order to engage in the more stable position, as he would not trust anything ever at any point, at which point you have the development of those communities which are socially engineered correctly or incorrectly into the communist position, allows our maturity into the subject, qualifying the hyper investment into the network as a total insurance mechanism overseeing the position, at which point you have the alternative to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, as they are private insurances through the network, which inherently is a capitalist position, at which point their validation of collective support of members of the position allows them to engage in the algorithm of the brokerage in order to manufacture a competent capitalist solution to the problem, which is their study of David Bowles is their being saved from communism, as the idea of David Bowles is the thing that will save them, at which point The further they study the subject, the more capitalist and competent they become, and the more the social engineers' subversion of their communities is reversed, at which point the social engineering being collapsed, you have the position of the original market without the obstructions through the use of criminal coercion. Now, the use of criminal coercion through J-secularist coercion to overthrow the states for the insurrection of the Confederacy through the military insurrection qualifies their use over the control of sexual options as rape as a contract is provided through their mechanisms, at which point their surveillance over the entire population of the subject is their control and manipulation of sexual options, such as opportunities, people you see in proper or necessary context, in order to assert whether or not you were into them, qualifying the manipulation as a function of coercion for sex, which is the function of rape, which means by definition all sex is rape. Until the Americans remove the Confederacy, this can be the only necessary position, at which point the argument of abortion is that the exceptions are the danger of the mother or in cases of rape. The danger to the mother is the danger to the mother, and the function of rape is every child from sex, which is all children, which is all sex, which qualifies the position of all of them being children of rape, at which point you have the manipulation of the subject primarily focusing aggressively on the black communities or the ones being socially engineered into the unstable, collapsing structures, at which point the dilapidation of their system being socially engineered, including the use of coercion and violence in order to destroy any successful black communities, such as the ones that they destroyed by violence or the government that they overthrew because the blacks were elected in, I believe it was North Carolina, includes the position of the destruction of their communities and the flooding of the communities and the generation of lakes in order to conceal the secret of their terrorist destruction of any competent representation of competent black communities, which is the communication that the only ones that aren't going to receive the violence are the ones who are supportive of the position of the blacks' inferiority on the basis of them being victimized by these criminal uses of coercion as KKK lynch mobs for the position of the argument that they are genetically and thus morally inferior. On the basis that they are genetically morally inferior, you have the arguments justifying their use of the criminal terrorisms, such as their positions of the stops and frisks, which is the subversion in the arguments such as Donald Trump's arguments of stop and frisk, which is the use of the surveillance, includes the use of the surveillance in order to pursue people for terrorisms and social engineerings and abuses of various kinds, which is more than just the observation of looking at them and starting false investigations in order to create dirt or a larger folder on the investigation or profile, which would qualify the easiness by which to engage in the criminal uses of force through the fraudulent use of government on the basis of the hyper-investigation, which is qualified in the surveillance mechanisms as fruit of the poison tree and thus not submittable. But that is not relevant to the ones doing it because the position is the argument of the use of subversive fraud, and the development of the normalization of the subversive fraud is the argument that the Confederate lynch mobs who infiltrate the cops are ACAB. All Confederates are bastards, at which point you understand that the development of the use of fraud through law enforcement is the position. The argument for defund the police is subversive, as not all cops are bastards, all Confederates are bastards. And since all Confederates are bastards, the Confederates being in charge of those positions, having infiltrated them, are advancing Confederate loyalists and suppressing American loyalists, and thus the suppression of the American loyalists do not allow for the advancement of the legitimate American loyalists, at which point you have the position of insurgent espionage as a mechanism of war, qualifying the destruction of the United States by infection. at which point defund the police would not necessarily engage in the position of any substantive position so long as you do not defund the Confederate loyalists, at which point that would require a full legitimate investigation against police and police unions and the others necessary to engage in a lawful settlement of the public will on what to do with them, qualifying our remedy to Confederate war crimes. At which point you understand the position of David is primarily through the function of his brokerage, which is profitable primarily off of commissions, which is the exchanging of contracts. The more contracts are exchanged, the more contract commissions are generated, which is the primary profit motive, and thus the prosperity and wealth of the members of the network are an inherent interest of the network through the brokerage as its centerpiece, qualifying the position of the activity inside the network as the mechanism of its survival, and thus David's wealth is built upon the activity of the network, not necessarily the profits or margins of any particular contract. At which point you have the development of the pre-put contracts, which would be a put for a put. If a put is the purchase or the right to purchase over 10 stock contracts, then the put of the put would be 10 would be the control over the 10 puts over the 10 contracts each, which would be 100. At which point you would have the development of the subcontracting in the investigation of the position of peoples actively investing into the resource, qualifying their position in the development of status by their investment into those systems, at which point those systems would be purchased in a special algorithm agreement with him and them in order to split any particular profits, and their perpetual devotion to the subject as a mechanism of their devotion into the network, which is the qualifier of status or bonus credit scores, at which point the bonus credit score is an advancement of a credit score, which is someone giving money into a credit card company or to a bank in order to increase their credit score so that they get better rates, at which point you have this consistent mechanisms, which is the social norm of the economic arrangements from the projections in the warrants of the Confederate war on David, which is what they think they're doing, and their belief that David, being an economic stabilizer to the United States, is specifically subversive to their destabilizing of the economy in order to overthrow the government, in order to ignore the civilian arguments, and thus there is no consent of the governed, because these are acts of war by terrorist secret insurrection from the Ku Klux Klan and the new Ku Klux Klan as the Neo Ku Klux Klan, which is their functional position as they are avid loyalists to the KKK, and the development of its arbitrary diversities through their Druid mechanism, which is the priests that would be over everyone else, which are intentionally going to be less intelligent to make them easier to control, at which point the destruction of competent, educated, wealthy would be the subversion of their mechanism, at which point their destruction of the educated is the position, which is the manufacture of clown world, which is their world. And the devotion of no remedy to a secret is the validation of clown world, or the destruction of all competence inside society, as common sense is their inherent moral adversary, in which case we have the development of our engagement of the early life, which starts from that point, which is the starting assets or the starting society, which qualifies David as king from birth. Is born the patriarchy, he is the patriarchy over them, David's pronouns, including the position of his natural titles as patriarchy, is the position of his sexuality, he is the patriarchy. At which point you understand the inherent nature of highly professional, serious adults as a collective community surrounding David in the network would have been the foundational position of his starting assets, and thus his starting wealth, and thus the position of the hyperscrutiny from their argument qualifies his starting positions, which could only be changed by David as David is born king. David being born king qualifies any possible alteration which they would have already been normalized to the horoscope, which is the prophecy, which is their anticipation for the development of their society and its prosperity. At which point you have the development of his early life, which would have included the normal positions of his trades in the United States, Japan, and Russia. Once Russia engages in the use of the insurance against the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have these normal arrangements, which is key to the Japanese argument in many of their positions from the record, qualifying their development into the long-term, decades-long arrangements of their long-term investment on the basis of their estimate of David, which qualifies their early development and preparations for the maturity, at which point you do not have a surprise position, as they would have easily been fully preparing for the subject since the 70s before the collapse of the Soviet Union under David's zombie insurance mechanism from their estimates, at which point all of this would have had hyper preparations, and the market speaks to the issue far more than any of David's actions, at which point the development of the mechanism of the market as a whole is the true calculation over anything that David would or would not do. At which point you have these subversions in the position of his hyper-education, at which point the signing and advancing of many contracts which require David's approval, which requires them to hyper-accelerate any signal or possible thing to be interpreted as David's answers, which would generate tutors and teachers and advisors and scientists to engage in the position of try and coax out what they believe the answer be from, reading their signs, the, fucking hawks in the sky twirling about, or whatever thing that they think they need to do in order to do it is on the basis of their position as insurance speculators, qualifying the development of essential aspects of the market, qualifying the hyper-acceleration of David's education through the position of summer school in order to get past another grade. So, 1 year would be the first grade and then second grade during summer school, this type of thing. At which point you have the hyper young David, who would be actively engaging in the advanced ages from the other students who would have not had the hyper acceleration, and thus the normal speed qualifies David as dealing with them while they are older, while he is younger, under the expectation of his superiority and importance, qualifying his position of engaging in mostly solo sports, as he would be exceptionally younger than most of them, at which point the only real exception that would not prohibit that would be like basketball or something, at which point the development of basketball would increase the strategies of the investment of half courts between the 3-point lines, behind the 3-point line to half court, and this would mostly be the strategy David would have to use, as he would be exponentially younger than them, qualifying his need to adapt to his advantage over their advantages, and thus, since they would exponentially be larger than him and tougher than him and faster than him, he would need to stay to the center of the court, qualifying any actual ability to do anything, at which point all of those games would be specifically designed to this. Games like soccer would become impossible as the size difference. Obviously, these are inherent estimates to the position, qualifying the majority of the effort would be primarily focused on individual sports such as free diving or martial arts, etc. At which point you have the understanding of the development of David in the arrangements with the cheerleaders as an amplifier of his gymnastics, at which point, as the patriarchy, he must consistently be surrounded by the most attractive, charismatic women at all times, as it is essential to the function as the male leader of their society, that he constantly has an intimate touch to the issues of all of the peoples by which he would directly have influence or control over their living conditions. At which point, the development of the attractive barrier or the talent barrier would qualify people's ability to engage in the advertisements through the attractive or the talent, at which point David would only talk to the talent in question, and everyone else negotiating every other kind of thing would have to go to the talent, as the talent is the only ones that would be able to competently represent the issue through all of the systems and normalized cultures through their active adaptation, as that would be their primary work in question. It is essential to understand this as it is developed into the position of maturing into his position as general, which includes his investments into the intelligence oversight, which includes his hyper-study of military intelligence and secrets, such as the development of non-reversible secret technology, which David would have actively amplified with his own studies and advancements, which would mean that David would have equipment that they could not reproduce or estimate or anticipate, which means their suicide missions for David or their impossible missions. The missions impossible would be subverted by David's inherent superiority, which would qualify their obligation to subvert him by the use of turning the president against him. Now, if the Americans are in control, the president being against him means that none of these things are a legal function, and thus they cannot inherently sabotage his network or the general economy or his reputation in any particular way, except for his subversion by the assassins in question through the military function of espionage, for the function of the Confederates bureaucrats being jealous of David, seeking his eradication, would seek to destroy him through the president's orders, which would force David to engage in the war on terror being subverted until that point, which would generate his position of having to go incognito for an extended period of time, at which point there is many projections that had asserted their absolute confidence that he would have actively been dealing with the Russians throughout all of these times, and thus maturing his relationships with Russia, including their position in the war on terror, which would be one, even if the president turns on David, the war on terror would still be getting fought by David while actively avoiding the Confederates' terrorists, at which point the Confederate terrorists seeking his destruction understand inherently the intelligence oversight would be subversive to the position of Confederate espionage war against the United States, at which point they either kill David or David dismantles the Confederacy, is their functional argument, which I have no qualms with. All of their resources they provided have been fact-checked and certified, at which point I have every confidence that they believe these things are true, at which point many of the missions would have to accomplish both of the things, including the position of the president being compromised, where David would have superiority or the ability to hurt him in some way and then refuse to, which would certify the reinforcement of the fact that it is Confederate defamation and not to be taken seriously, which, as the position is that they have his ear and David doesn't, David would actively be put further and further and further away from the president, at which point the 8 years of the president from the 9/11 war on terror to its conclusion would actively be compromised in the secret orders against David, which would not transfer to the next president, allowing David to return after the next president, as the next president had not had the investment in order to have him subverted against David, at which point things would be allowed to be returned as usual, which gives David the code name or call sign Odysseus, which is their original projection and understanding from the very beginning as a collective understanding of those who were in the know in the intelligence function, that anyone who joins his branch is functionally following Odysseus. These are all functional suicide missions. These are high-grade national security issues at the top level, at the highest complications, requiring the most expertise. At which points you have the functional mentality of most of the people who would be following David in the development of all of these systems, qualifying their being targeted by the Confederacy for eradication, as the assassination contracts and harassment contracts and terrorism contracts would be inherent to the subversion of the network and his support structure, at which point anyone they think would be connected with David is an enemy of the Confederacy, as he is their mortal adversary, which I have zero argument against. Now, their position on these arrangements, such as their targeting of Snowden or Julian Assange, is their assumption of his connections to David, at which point the development of the positions would be subcontracted under David as intelligence oversight, which would generate our general obligations, at which points the understanding that they would be deputized under the function of national security, which would have the permit contracts from the president, would legalize all of their actions as they had been deputized under the direct orders of the president in his secret orders to David in order to develop national security against the insurgent threat, qualifying the acts of subversions against the communities, against their food supplies, against their economies, against their societies, to be socially engineered into complete collapse, which has to be subverted by the use of distribution of competent information in order to get a remedy to Confederate war crimes or false secrets or false science, or however they want to label it according to their criminal strategies. With this in mind, the Kim Possible's Ron factor is the active assumption of the position of the development of the popular normal cheerleader who actively associates with the unpopular or not supremely noticeable Ron, at which point you have the development of the hyper-acceleration of the competence presented or abilities amplified by the girl spy in question, which would qualify their development, as David would need competent members of his community actively being able to conduct their systems without him, requiring their hyper-acceleration and normal position in the development of their training. As they gain confidence, they become more capable, and the development of their capabilities being normalized can tolerate his absence and thus not his acceleration. And without his acceleration, as he is Odysseus, he won't always be there, and thus he needs them to get them to maturity, to the proper skills, at the adequate amount of speed. At which point you have many of these impossible missions which are based upon that concept, as David would have actively been training his entire life for these solo sports, naturally inherent to the position of his spy functions, as the intelligence oversight would require him from time to time to be in the field, which is why he would be vulnerable to the position, at which point you have the acknowledgement of the development of the community, at which point you have the acknowledgement of the development of all of the economic stabilities projected for David, at which point we understand the inherent threat David poses to the Confederacy, and thus the hatred of those loyal to the Confederacies and the irrational harassments against him, as they are all fundamentally based upon the fact that he is a catastrophic threat to the existence of their criminal societies. And since David's systems would be placed into the position of auto-adaptations, would not be legal for them to subvert under the agreements which would be crafted as the prerequisite of all of his preparations, qualifying the inability to touch qualifying the stability of all of his systems in place through the position, at which point they, not being able to do anything about him, said that members of Congress making agreements with David, though highly desirable, is subversive to the existence of the Confederacy, and thus the Nazis prohibited Congress, their superior in law, from doing things necessary to their office, and thus the engagement of avoiding David is a subversion of their office and not an action of their office, removing their argument that they were acting according to their job, at which point, since they were not doing their job, they were acting as individuals without a legal government, without legal protections of their office, which is necessary for us to observe in the development of the duel or the court case necessary in Congress in order to cover all of the necessary information in order to declare war on the Confederacy for the stability and national security of these United States. And as David would be an active developing political party throughout the states, you understand that any action against him is an action against their lawfully elected government, which was subverted by criminal voter fraud, by Confederate terrorism, at which point the infection removing them is an act of criminal voter fraud, which is subversive to the position, which qualifies them as not republic elected government, at which point, since they are not the legal government, they cannot claim the authorities of the legal government unless they revert back to their office's duties from the expectation at the time of the case, which would observe David's parties in their governments, which, if you're going to develop the Confederate position of having sway in California, which is a viable argument, they did have exponential periods of times in order to develop their fake science centers, qualifying their eugenics eradications or genocides, would actively be a relevant issue, at which point you have to understand the inherent bias of their argument is on their development of voter fraud, which requires us to remove or separate the entirety of their development into the natural economy, qualifying their use of terrorisms or secrets as specifically prohibited from the expectation at the time of the case as an act of war against the United States is inherently criminal, qualifying their position of overthrowing their state as an act of treason, and that using their captured equipment from their state, which is not under the Republic's control, but the Confederacy's engaging in civil war, qualifies all of these actions and equipments and agents and motives as criminal treason, qualifying their eradication as necessary to national security, qualifying our engagement of the observation of the power brokering through David's political party, qualifying not just the political party inside the mechanism of all of the states and federal government, but also the prerequisite influence from trading through David's brokerage through the power brokering of his political party, qualifies a high aspect of his economic prowess and influence within inside the United States as the lawful authority in question, at which point you have the development of their progress of Confederate interests, which includes their destruction of Native Americans or federally protected lands like state or federal forests, at which point they're selling and filing off resources from those locations is a specific subversion of their holding in trust the lands and properties and equipments and resources in question, which would be substantially subversive and normal to their engagement as Confederate loyalists. Their subversion of Social Security is specifically designed to collapse Social Security, along with the other federal social programs, which were created in order to give the argument to the poor of the United States, the validation or calming them down, at which point collapsing the promise to them as they are fraud or Ponzi schemes would be the development of the position, at which point the thing that was designed to calm them down is no longer relevant as they created their alternative Confederate structures, qualifying their lack of need for these systems in order to calm down the public, which they no longer need consent as Confederates are not Americans, and the American consent is irrelevant to Confederate power, at which point you have the complete subversion of all of these mechanisms for the sales and distribution of the resources in question. That and other behind closed doors agreements between the Confederate insurgents qualifying their development of corruption or the color of long color of office for the non-authority functions in their secret agreements qualifies their ability to engage in the systematic dismantlement of the United States, turning into a barren wasteland, qualifying its lack of worth as they are selling the United States off into the various positions for the Confederacy and the other enemies of the United States, such as their engagement of developing adversaries, which they have historically done, such as Russia with the Cold War or China, which was created from communism and matured into prosperity through the capitalism of the world, assisting them in the loans, qualifying the boost through the Hegelian dialectic of the creation of the thesis and the antithesis, qualifying their ability to destroy both into the synthesis, qualifying the position of the Druid overlords, at which point the Druid terrorists in question, such as the Catholics, the Jacobin threat, as it were, is just the ingestion of paganism into Christianity, qualifying its evolution through infection, loyal and subject to the position of the escaped Druids into the recreation of the functional Druid oversight, at which point the argument from many of the investigations which have been revealed and verified qualifies the Jacobins and Catholics as Druids, at which point the Druid system was not an eradicated system. It was just evolved and changed under the symbolism of Christianity for the pagan worship and the worship of idols and the position of accelerating the Druid norms and cultures through the adaptations disguised as something else in order to allow for the normalization in the functional historic cultures to protect themselves, at which point the position of them having destroyed the Druids or other cultures' religious practices is a function of them having secret control over them, at which point they would be preserved in their secret archives, allowing them to make these adaptations in the preservation of their cultures without common access, making all of their religious practices and functions secrets and thus not discoverable by investigation. At which point you have many of the Confederate positions as puzzle pieces putting into place, at which point many of the Confederate wealthy would actively be coercive against the function of the Christian Catholics in the priesthood, qualifying their ability to use the church as a false cover or legitimacy in order to take the Lord's name in vain or make a false promise on the basis of God without his authority or backing, qualifying the normalization of the position as frauds or thieves or con artists. They're here to lie, steal, and kill as their father Satan, including the position of their converts to Nazism from the Jewish communities, as they are the synagogue of Satan and not Jews at all, qualifying their position of crafting their inherent conspiracies as their criminal subversions, such as the learned elders of Zion, which is the functional development of many of their communities, which allows for them to engage in the use of insurance fraud in order to kill lots of Jews who protect the Jewish conspiracy, which would mean that they're actively engaging in intentional suicide to murder their children and their relatives and their neighbors, qualifying the permission of doing so for their position as mafia members is normal. The act of mafia using murder, abuse, destruction of property, all of this is normal to mafia functions. They're just criminals. And as the function of exclusively criminals, you have the maturity of how they're systematically doing this. And in the Jewish community, they have many traditions, such as the tradition of trusting Jews even against highly reliable non-Jews, at which point their inherent culture being developed to blindly trust their own race against anyone who would speak against them, which would qualify their position of their blind loyalties and subjugations to their Nazi mafia, who are setting them up for eradication. At which point, they're aiding and abetting in an act of suicide. At which point you understand the inherent complexities and problems of not having a constitutional law or rule of law. At which point the subversion of their safety is the subversion of the rule of law, and thus the only way for them to be safe is for them to validate or restore or reinforce the permanent rule of law mechanisms against all subversions or advantages inherent to the development of the lawless coercion as a terrorist organization or mafia is the oversight, which includes the position of their development throughout Hollywood, which is a known fact, at which point their inherent connection to the banks and Hollywood and the propagandists and etc. develop their positions such as they're being used against the black community who at some point boycotted them into compliance until they had to restore their validation into wokeness in the certification of the legitimacy of treating blacks as equal in order to still get their money, at which points they're kind of looked down on, which would be an active interest in their development in the foreign markets, such as the China, which they would have used their connections in the banks in order to develop into a false capitalist system, taking them from the poverty of communism into the prosperity of capitalism through the international wealth or banks, which is intimately connected to them, at which point having China and the foreign markets available to them, they would be less reliant upon the black community, and thus the false reliance on the black community is only virtue signaling until it's collapsed beneath them, similar to Social Security and the federal social programs. These are designed collapsed systems by the building of false confidence from the false relationships from their inherent systems, qualifying them being eased into the trapped into a false confidence as they are inherently an enemy and would be targeted for the criminal subversion, for the collapse of their systems in order to re-engage in the position of treating the house niggers as inferiors once again, qualifying their no longer needing to treat them as house niggers, as they are no longer necessary to the function, at which point they return to normal slavery, at which points they become field niggers again, at which point there's no need for a house nigger as they are all inherently field workers, at which points you have the collapse of the ecosystem subversion from their environmental arguments, from their false green parties, qualifying the removal of oil and other essential positions to the modern technologies, such as the energy crisis going on in Europe, except for these locations, which would be collapsed into the position which would remove the technologies of the common commodities currently available, at which point you have the destruction of the technology, and with the collapse, such as in the Netherlands, of the farming equipment, you would have to return to original physical labor quality, which is the position of them justifying the re-engagement of nigger plantation slavery, at which point with that nigger is their inherent nature and interest in development, at which point all black members of the general community who are siding with them are inherently subversive towards their communities as a suicide mechanism into the false reliance that their cooperation with the Confederates will gain them better superiority or acknowledgement, while receiving the position of destroying their community as a con will receive themselves the same functional con, at which point they are not able to save themselves or anyone relatively connected to themselves, as they will inherently return to Jim Crow separate functions, at which point separate but equal, but not really equal at all, would be returned as the status quo norm, as the other functions in the other communities would also be equally dismantled as the function of the reinstatement of the Nazi destruction of non-preferred races and communities would actively be enforced as state law, at which point the position of Scalia, as the false original study is, would be that if the custom provided by the Nazis were to order to the judiciary, who is not an equal branch of government at all, gives the order to prosecute them on the basis of the race, the Scalia position is that the judges have no lawful right to refuse the order to the full processing and conviction through non-due process for the kangaroo courts is the only loyalty of Confederacy.